The United States has and will always have a reputation for interfering with other nations and their elected officials. This was no different in the 1950s when the United States had their eyes set on a new target, Juan Jacobo Árbenz Guzman, a major figure in the 1944 Guatemalan Revolution, former Minister of National Defense, and the newly elected 25th President of Guatemala. When Árbenz took power, Guatemala had a glaring issue regarding land ownership and a tough dependency on foreign companies. These are things that he spoke on in his inaugural address. At the time of his election, around 2% of the population controlled 72% of Guatemala's usable land. This led to Guatemala having issues with poverty, malnutrition, and other health problems. Árbenz stated this: "All the riches of Guatemala are not as important as the life, the freedom, the dignity, the health, and the happiness of the most humble of its people." How wrong would we be if, mistaking the means for the end, we were to set financial stability and economic growth as the supreme goals of our policy, sacrificing them to the well-being of our masses? Our task is to work together in order to produce more wealth, but we must distribute these riches so that those who have less, and they are the immense majority, benefit more, while those who have more, and they are so few, also benefit but to a lesser extent. How could it be otherwise, given the poverty, the poor health, and the lack of education of our people? On June 17, 1952, Decree 900 was passed, a land reform program that would take uncultivated land from large landowners and transfer it to the people. This resulted in nearly 1.5 million acres of land being distributed to around 100,000 families in Guatemala. Those who had land taken from them were compensated with government bonds. One of those affected by this reform bill was the United Fruit Company, Guatemala's largest landowner and employer. The United Fruit Company owned approximately 550,000 acres of land. With Árbenz's new land reform bill, the company was at risk of losing around 200,000 to 300,000 acres of their unused land. Although the Guatemalan government compensated the company for its land, the United Fruit Company disputed the amount, claiming that the land was worth much more than they were given. As the land reform bill was taking off and land was being redistributed, the United Fruit Company turned to the United States with the desire of removing Árbenz from presidency. Unfortunately for Árbenz, the United Fruit Company had key players deep inside the U.S. government. Allen Dulles was the deputy director of the CIA, but shifted to the director of the CIA during the involvement with Guatemala. Dulles had connections to the United Fruit Company due to him previously working for Sullivan and Cromwell, a controversial law firm that extensively represented United Fruit Company in the past. Dulles is also known as one of the most, if not the most, controversial CIA figure in U.S. history. John Foster Dulles was, quote, Eisenhower's chief diplomatic advisor, the foreign policy spokesman for both the president and the party, end quote, as well as the brother of Allen Dulles. John Foster Dulles was also a former lawyer and chairman for the United Fruit Company under Sullivan and Cromwell, and at the time was the U.S. Secretary of State. John Moores Cabot was the, quote, Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs in 1953 and had previously served as an ambassador to Guatemala, also held a substantial amount of stock in the United Fruit Company, end quote. Thomas Dudley Cabot was the director and president of the United Fruit Company in the late 1940s. In 1951, Cabot became the director of international security affairs in the State Department. Other prominent members of the U.S. government with ties to the United Fruit Company include Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., Sinclair Weeks, Robert Cutler, John J. McCloy, Ann Whitman, Robert Hill, Robert Lehman, etc. The savior to the United Fruit Company's problem became known as Operation PBSuccess. According to the declassified CIA documents, the planners decided to employ simultaneously all of the tactics that had proved useful in previous covert operations. PBSuccess would combine psychological, economic, diplomatic, and paramilitary actions. Operations in Europe, redacted in Iran, had demonstrated the potency of propaganda, psychological warfare, aimed at discrediting an enemy and building support for allies. Like many Americans, U.S. officials placed tremendous faith in the new science of advertising. Touted as the answer to underconsumption, economic recession, and social ills, advertising, many thought, could be used to cure communism as well. In 1951, the Truman administration tripled the budget for propaganda and appointed a psychological strategy board to coordinate activities. The CIA required Psy-War training for new agents who studied Paul Linebarger's text, psychological warfare, and grifter novels like The Big Con for disinformation tactics. PBSuccess's designers plan to supplement overt diplomatic initiatives such as the OAS conference convened to discredit Guatemala, with black operations using contacts within the press, radio, church, army, and other organized elements susceptible to rumor, pamphleteering, poster campaigns, and other subversive actions. They were particularly impressed with the potential for radio propaganda, which had turned the tide at a critical moment in the Iran operation. In order to effectively use radio broadcasting as a viable way to sway public opinion, the CIA needed to analyze and understand the Guatemalan radio scene. The CIA analyzed the total number of radio receiving sets across Guatemala. Here they found out there are around 72,000 radio sets across a country of about 3 million people. However, a majority of these radios were found to be in urban centers. The CIA noticed that Guatemalans did not often listen to the radio. However, they did perceive it as an authoritative source. This is likely due to Árbenz's regime having an official radio station, La Voz de Guatemala. The CIA believed that word of mouth would be the most effective for transferring information in the country. The CIA believed that using a radio broadcast, quote, can be a useful psychological weapon against communism and communists in Guatemala, end quote. It was recommended that these broadcasts should be used to A. Disproving the government's claim to the above effect with detailed factual information. Manufactured evidence is not necessary in this case, as there is plenty of factual evidence. B. Discrediting intellectuals who have fallen for the communist line. C. Warning intellectuals who may be used by the communists. D. Citing examples and praising intellectuals who have refused to be used by the communists. E. Discrediting the government on grounds of inefficiency, incompetency, etc., particularly for its folly in allowing itself to be duped, deceived, and trapped in its present unfavorable international situation by agents of international communism sent to Guatemala from other countries for precisely that purpose. F. Building up the idea that there is no advantage in supporting this government, which has already set its course toward inevitable destruction. The communists will not let anything survive which they cannot dominate. Once they have achieved a position of any influence whatsoever, this truth can be shown by tracing the history of the communists in the Spanish Republic and after the Civil War. They broke up and destroyed all moderate leftist groups, betrayed every collaborator whom they could not absorb. They had done the same thing to the Spanish circulos in Guatemala, Mexico, Cuba. There is an abundance of evidence on this subject and might be used to offset the time given by the official Guatemalan radio to Spanish Republican affairs. On May 1st, 1954, the Voice of Liberation had its first broadcast. The station would refer to itself as multiple names: Radio Liberación, La Voz de la Liberación para los Guatemaltecos, and La Voz de la Liberación Guatemalteca. This was filled with typical radio banter, popular recordings, humor, and anti-government rhetoric. The radio hosts stated that they are, quote, deep in the jungle, end quote, of Guatemala, calling for all Guatemalans to resist Árbenz's. The 2-hour show was replayed 4 times on the first day. From then on, the show would typically stick to playing an hour-long program at 7 a.m. and 9 p.m. Once further conflict arose, it would play more often throughout the day. Despite claiming that the hosts were in the Guatemalan jungle, the radio was actually recorded near Miami by 2 Guatemalan men and 1 Guatemalan woman. The CIA would take the audio recordings of the broadcast and take them to another location in a neighboring country of Guatemala where it would be broadcasted via a mobile transmitter. This was the typical introduction for the radio station. They would have 2 separate sign-ons that would be mixed in with their national anthem.
Atención Guatemala, atención guatemaltecos, Radio Liberación en 6.360 kilociclos, onda corta les habla.
Esta es la emisora clandestina del Movimiento Libertador Guatemalteco,
operando en su frecuencia de 6.360 kilociclos onda corta y desde algún lugar secreto de la República. Escúchenos usted y sabrá la realidad del momento político porque atraviesa Guatemala y los progresos irrefutables del gran movimiento libertador. Durante el transcurso de nuestras transmisiones diarias, damos a ustedes música, comentarios y noticias en general, y demostramos palpablemente el crimen de la dominación comunista y la fuerza incontenible de nuestra gran cruzada de liberación. En el aire, los transmisores clandestinos de Radio Liberación de Guatemala en 6.360 kilociclos onda corta.
The Voice of Liberation also had two decalogues, or creeds, that would be stated throughout their broadcasting. One was the ideological decalogue, giving reasons as to why the people of Guatemala should not support communism, and the other was the military decalogue, a call for honor, patriotism, discipline, and other more nationalistic traits. We could not be communists because communism denies the existence of God as the beginning and end of the purest ideals of the human being, and attempts to instill the antithesis of historical materialism, confusing effects with causes. Places the values and interests of the party over those of the fatherland, and the fatherland has primacy which no one can change without engaging in the most vile treason, cannot allow that the freedom is indispensable for human life, nor does it recognize the majesty of the law, destroys faith, ideals, and the spirit of individual self-improvement, without which human progress is impossible. Communism does not understand that faith, ideals, and the spirit of improvement have been the fountains from which have sprung prosperity, well-being, greatness, and civilization. It ignores the existence of moral values, and man without morality is no better than the animals that exist in his natural world, and lacks the capacity to distinguish between good and evil. Destroys the formative school of the home, the foundation of all social life, of morality, cooperation, humanitarianism, is based on absurdities. It imposes ideological equality and of satisfactions, an equality which even nature denies us. Communism believes it is essential to pull back those in front so that those behind can catch up with them. It destroys the existent to create a new order rather than improving on what is considered unsatisfactory. Has as its only visible achievement to date the enslavement of millions of workers, thousands of concentration camps, and millions of cadavers shouting from the afterlife that they preferred death to misery, death to the subjugation of a man, to a ration of bread on one hand and the specter of a whip on the other. Exploits envy and all the low passions that the inept holds from the capable, that the lazy man holds for the working man, that the vice-ridden holds for the virtuous, for the haves hold for the have-nots. Considers work to be an instrument of enslavement, and not a noble attribute which permits the human to satisfy his aspirations, closing the door to the initiatives of the worker, and demanding from him a total subjugation of ideas and actions. The military decalogue includes honor, patriotism, loyalty, character, discipline, dignity, camaraderie, faith, valor, abnegation. Honor, synthesis of military virtues and highest attribute on the scale of human values. It is a religion without the practice of which true military existence cannot be imagined. Patriotism, the purest of loves for the soil on which we were born, that which joins us to our parents and children, and to everything about life, our people, and future of the fatherland. Without its constant practice, the military man can never meet the sacred tasks of the institution and the imperative duties of our nationality. Loyalty, the security key from which he who gives the treasure of his confidence and friendship. In the soldier, it is a vital condition because without it, he cannot be the guarantor of order, defender of institutions, guardian of the fatherland. Discipline, rigorous observance of the norms which justify moral hierarchies. Its degree of perfection depends on the correlation that must exist between the hierarchy of those virtues and the military grade scale. Without the correlation, there is no military discipline. Character, distinguishing feature of he who is firm of purpose and faithful in his duties. In the army, the basis of the national soul. Genuine expression of the armed forces. A soldier without this attribute is inconceivable. Camaraderie, indestructible link that unites men forged in identical disciplines and in the realization of the same ideals. That spiritual strengthens enthusiasm, raises morale, and characterizes the army as the soldier's home. Dignity, of a man's essential purposes, For a soldier, it is the torch that guides his spirit, the quality that ennobles his acts. Faith, the light that illuminates the spirit, fortifies the will, and maintains the torch of hope permanently lit. Without it, the soldier lacks the shield that makes the spirit invincible, the will unbreakable. Abnegation, integral and voluntary sacrifice to defend the great causes and to attain the most precious ideals. In a soldier, it is motive for profound satisfaction and legitimate pride. Valor, the spirit's strength in the face of danger, dignity in defeat, magnanimity in victory. Through its generous influx, the soldier does his duty, eludes complicity, dies before surrendering. Honor, patriotism, loyalty, character, discipline, camaraderie, faith, valor, abnegation. This is the military decalogue. Some of the jokes that were said are also in the CIA documents. Oh, what a beautiful meal. That is a picture of Jacobo. Árbenz says to his wife, I'm going to fire my driver. Today was the third time he almost got me killed. Don't be that way, she responds. Why don't you give him another chance? Maria Árbenz is reading the paper and says to her husband, Wow, I never realized a woman could weigh that much. How heavy? Árbenz asked. It says here an English woman lost 3,000 pounds. Public Health Minister Julio Roberto Herrera was touring an insane asylum and spotted an inmate holding a fishing rod out the window with the line going down to the garden below. What are you fishing for, my friend? Asked Herrera. Idiots, said the inmate. I see. How many have you caught so far? You are the 9th. There are 2 specific songs that would be featured on the broadcasts. La Profecia and Los Trinqueteros. The translation provided in documents state that there is a bit of a disconnect when translating into English since the, quote, words and syntax are uniquely rural Guatemalan and do not lend themselves to easy understanding or translation, end quote. There are numerous refrains listed in the documents giving the reader an idea as to what the Guatemalan listener would hear. Communism is the bloodiest and most voracious imperialism ever known by humanity, for it has no God, no fatherland, no home. Influenced by their Kremlin patrons, the Guatemalan communist leaders have been preaching violence as the means to attain practical objectives, for they have no concern for the life of Guatemalans. The future happiness of Latin America depends on the proper exploitation of its natural resources through harmonious cooperation between workers and enterprises. Synopses of the broadcasts are still available to the public through the CIA's Historical Collections section of their website. Here are a few interesting examples. May 8th. This morning, we will explain why Russia is interested in having Guatemala to be one of its satellites. People don't understand why there's a pseudo-democratic government under Árbenz in place. These people are not well informed. It is our duty to tell them the truth. Then we will see if they respond to our cause. Russia is interested in Guatemala because it can house strategically placed air bases, from which attacks can be launched against the USA and Argentina and others. Only 2 hours to Panama, 3 hours to the Texas oil fields. These are the bases needed by Russia. Imagine Soviet planes dropping atomic bombs on San Diego, Texas, or even New York. Now you can see why the Soviets are so interested in Guatemala. We Guatemalans must impede at all costs this continuing communist penetration. We must save all America. Russia must die in Guatemala. We can wait no longer. The traitors at the head of the government of the degenerate Árbenz have disgraced the concept of liberty and democracy. Either the Árbenz government dies or we die. Guatemalans, to the struggle. The Guatemalans' cause for freedom and democracy must survive. Our total liberation is only a few days away. Be ready for the struggle. Guatemala must be free. May 11th. Makes fun of government for insisting that the Radio Liberación is in a neighboring country and surely they will launch some official protest soon. Anyway, we continue to encourage you in our daily struggle, but be patient. You will have your fun, but not yet. And speaking of that, the government is preparing another salamatazo to entrap our supporters. So be careful. Don't do anything silly. It's not Liberation Day yet. We will let you know when it is. May 14th. The Guatemalan peasant is inexorably linked to the soil he works. The soil moistened by the sweat is part of his life. He caresses the soil that provides him and his family with the most basic necessities of life. Nevertheless, the peasant seldom owns the land he works, mainly because he did not know how to conserve what was passed on to him. Today, there is uncultivated and unproductive land all over the country, just as there are thousands of peasants who own no land. But the problem is vast, complex, and requiring of great intellect, goodwill, and the love of country to resolve. It has to be recognized that the peasants themselves were in part responsible for the loss of their lands. Many current landowners abuse the peasants' ignorance to gain large tracts of land at ridiculous prices. The peasants now are in great danger of succumbing to the propaganda of the communists. Some are being seduced. A responsible government will attend to the peasants' end in an honorable and patriotic way, not by ripping land away from the owners who have legitimate right to it and cultivate it effectively, but by distributing the land owned by the state and the owners who do not effectively work and develop their land. Fortunately, the peasants are beginning to see through the lies of the false apostles, and they are tired of the brutality which has drenched their soil in blood. The new government will provide the peasants with land in a legitimate way. With rights of inheritance, the new government will institute a new agrarian reform law, just and fair, and will provide all the necessary technical assistance to new owners. And that new government will need the support of you, the peasants, so be ready for the day which is near. Be ready, peasants, soon you will be free. June 20th. Combat instruction for civilians, men, women, and children. Women, you can help too. Make long telephone calls, leave the phone off the hook. This works against the communists. Drivers, you can help too. Taxi drivers can have their vehicles break down when carrying communist officials. Bus drivers can evade carrying large groups of people who help. Army mechanics, you can help too. Make the materials under your control unserviceable to the communist traders. All those who work in telecommunications can easily block communications that reveal the location of anti-communist forces, and also thwart the issuing of orders and instructions by the communists. Children, you can help too. Obstruct communist troop movements. Throw nails in the streets. Shine light when you hear our airplanes. Cut power cables or telephone lines. Railway and port workers, you can help too. Obstruct loading and unloading operations. Keep the convoys from arriving at their destinations. This can easily be done by breaking rails or weakening bridges. Road workers. A backhoe, a bulldozer, or any heavy vehicle abandoned on a roadway makes a great roadblock. Peasant. If your employer is anti-communist, help him in everything and ask him for progress reports on our movement. Form your own groups to fight for liberty. Send all information on communist troop movements and stop those movements. We will supply the groups you form. June 26th. The High Command informs the National Army and the populace of the necessary conditions for the restoration of peace and order. First, the Army is not our enemy and we are not the Army's enemy. The enemy of both is communism, personified by Jacobo Árbenz, Cruz, Ware, etc. Second, we appeal to all members of the Army to arrest all known members and sympathizers of the Communist Party. Third, we appeal to senior Army officers to capture Árbenz and establish an interim military junta. Fourth, the interim junta should immediately instruct all units to arrest all communists and prepare to join forces with the Liberation Army to restore order. These orders should apply to civil guard units under Army control. Fifth, the interim junta will establish the hour for a ceasefire, giving all commanders at least 3 hours notice. Immediately thereafter, the decision to form a new government should be announced over TGW or Radio Morse. The Executive Committee of the Liberation Army will immediately establish contact with the interim junta. Sixth, this call is made to the Army in the name of humanitarianism and before God, to thereby avoid the useless shedding of blood and devastation of our beloved Guatemala. Seventh, until these conditions are met, the Liberation Army will continue increasing its attacks using all human and military power to destroy communism and all those who make common cause with it. During the coup in Guatemala, the United States employed the Voice of Liberation radio broadcasts to exaggerate the strength and victories of Carlos Castillo Armas, the US-backed rebel leader. In reality, Armas commanded only a small and largely ineffective force. His impact was amplified by the United States' support, particularly through the use of P-47 fighter planes, which provided critical air support in assaults against Árbenz and the capital. As pressure mounted, Árbenz sought assistance from neighboring Mexico and El Salvador, but both countries declined to intervene. He then appealed to the United Nations Security Council, though only the Soviet Union expressed support. With the situation deteriorating and fearing a full-scale U.S. invasion, Árbenz resigned on June 27, 1954. He recorded a farewell message that would be later broadcasted, explaining that his resignation was intended to prevent further bloodshed and national devastation. After stepping down, he fled to exile into Mexico. Following the success of the CIA-led Operation PBSuccess, the Voice of Liberation ceased broadcasting permanently on July 2, 1954. Following the coup, Armas was installed as president with the backing and direct support of the United States. Once in power, he swiftly dismantled Decree 900, reversing approximately 95% of the changes. He outlawed communism and launched a widespread campaign of repression, resulting in the arrest of thousands across the country. As Armas consolidated power, his regime took on an increasingly authoritative characteristic. His assassination in 1957 plunged Guatemala into deeper political instability, setting the stage for a civil war that would engulf the nation for the next 36 years.